Hi, you're welcome to the sixth lesson of the Introduction to Hermeneutics course. In the last course, we talked about the errors that we can encounter while trying to interpret scripture. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the concept of context. What is context? Context is a word we throw around in Bible study and all. So, context is actually the entire life situation in which a passage of the Bible or a book of the Bible was written by the author. There are two types of context. There is number one, the general context, and number two, the literary context. Now, under general context, we have two divisions, the historical and the specific. Historical context is the situation in which an author wrote a book of the Bible or a passage of the Bible. Does that make sense to you? I think it does. So, under the historical context, we have number one, the geographical context, that is the location where it happened. After that, we have the social and the political context, that is the people that was in power or the societal situation in which an author wrote the book of the Bible. And lastly, we have the religious context. How religious were the people? Were they against God, like the Israelites were, or were they with God, like the early Christians were? Or were they pagan, like the Roman Empire was during the time that Paul wrote, and Peter and James and Jude and other New Testament authors? So those are the historical context, the subset of them. The second one is the specific context. What is the specific context? The specific context is the particular life situation in which an author wrote a book or a passage of the Bible. So when we're talking about specific context, we're talking about who the author is. We're talking about the date that the author wrote the book. We're talking about the recipient. To whom did the author write the book? We're talking about the situation. What was happening when the author wrote the book or that made the author write the book? And lastly, we're talking about the purpose. We're talking about the purpose. For what reason did the author write that book? And I'm going to give an example of Paul. Let us see the book of Corinthians. From where did Paul write it? Paul wrote it from Ephesus, and then he wrote it to Corinth. To whom did Paul write it? Paul wrote it to the Corinthians. When did Paul write it? Paul wrote it in AD 55. What was the situation? The situation was questions about some church practices. And what was the purpose? The purpose was to answer questions about these church practices. Now, why is it important to study the context of a text or a passage? It is because meaning is actually context dependent. You must understand the life situation that was around the author writing a particular book or passage of scripture. Remember, like we always say in this class, the Bible was not written to us, but it was written for us. So when we know what was happening in a specific context that made the author to write a book, then we can properly contextualize it and apply it to us today. And the last thing we're going to do today is we're going to check the few steps of Bible interpretation. Now you understand all the theory. Let us go into actually applying the rules of exegesis to a passage of scripture. The first thing you need to do when you want to study any passage or any book of the Bible is number one, understand the genre of that book. Are you reading a historical narrative like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers? Are you reading a poetry like the majority of the Psalms? Are you reading an eschatological literature like Revelations? Are you reading a parable? Are you reading a letter? Are you reading a book of the law? There are so many genres in scripture, and then you must first understand what the genre of the book you're about to read is before you start reading it. Secondly, you must establish a big picture of what a particular passage or a particular book is trying to say. That is it. So you must first read the entirety of the chapter or the chapters and say, oh, this is what this part of the Bible is trying to say. So when we see the book of Isaiah, we say in the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah was actually warning the Israelites about their idolatry, about their corrupt practices, and telling them about the impending judgment of God on them. So you must understand the entirety of what the big picture is. After that, number three, when you get to any part of scripture, the first thing you must do after reading through to understand the big picture, you must develop a thesis statement. What is that? You must say, oh, this is what this passage is talking about. You must extract one sentence or sentences to describe in a simple manner what you think a particular passage is talking about. Let us say Psalms 23. We can say, oh, this verse is talking about God's provision for the person who is led by God. So that is a thesis statement. Once you understand that thesis statement, it will guide your subsequent interpretation of that particular passage. Does that make sense to you? I think it does. And finally, step 4, consult commentaries. What are commentaries? Commentaries are the things scholars have done about the entirety of the Bible, explaining it, going to the word origin, going to what that particular part of scripture is trying to say. So scholars have read the Bible, they understand it using the best hermeneutical principles, and now they're making commentaries on it. So they tell you what the context is, they tell you the historical context, the specific context, and all this context. That is why commentaries, study Bibles are important when it comes to hermeneutics or the interpretation of scripture. So that is why it is important for you to consult commentaries. So commentaries are what scholars have said about the Bible, the passages, the book, they've studied it. They know the history, the context, the specific context, and they're making commentaries about them. In fact, they know the word origin, their Greek, their Hebrew, their Aramaic origin, and they've made comments about that. So these commentaries would actually guide you to understand more specifically and more contextually what scripture is talking about. So let's go over the process again. Number 1, understand the genre. Number 2, understand the big picture. Number 3, create a thesis statement. Number 4, get commentaries, get study Bibles so that you can dig deeper into what the scripture is saying hermeneutically. Was that a lot of information? I understand. Let us do a quick recap. Number 1, context is the life situation in which a book of the Bible happened. That are divided into 2, the historical and the specific. The historical talks about the geography, talks about the societal, talks about the political, and talks about the religious. While the specific talks about the author, the location, the recipient, the situation, and the purpose for writing the book. In the next class, we're going to talk about the principles of word study. That is where we'll see Greek and Hebrew. Then we'll see how to use this properly or why we use them. Thank you for staying with me so far, and see you in the next class.